As the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. Unfortunately, great power doesn't always land in great hands, sometimes landing in the hands least fit to wield it. Let's take a look at how the dynasty that ruled Russia for over 300 years would succumb to its end. When the bloodline of one dynasty meets its demise, another would rise. The death of Fyodor I, the last ruler of the Rurik dynasty in 1598, brought on a chaotic 15-year period of political crisis. A time of madness and disorder, filled with foreign intervention, peasant uprisings, and power struggles among random people who attempted to seize the throne, caused a major social and economic disruption, leaving the state itself at great risk of being destroyed. This period was known as the Time of Troubles, and would eventually come to an end when an assembly of the land, also known as a Zemsky Sobor, elected Mikhail Romanov as the new Czar in 1613. Between 1645 and 1682, the Romanov dynasty generally followed the custom of passing the throne to the oldest son or closest male relative if no sons were born, going from Mikhail to his son Alexis, then his son Fyodor III within that time. After Fyodor III's death, the way in which the throne was passed from heir to heir would be less conventional. His brother Ivan and his half-brother Peter found themselves head-to-head at becoming the new Czar, eliciting the involvement of the Zemsky Sobor, who came to a decision that Peter would rule. This didn't go over well with Ivan's family, who revolted against the decision, backed by the support of the Streltsy, a military unit which ultimately led to a new decision that both Ivan and Peter would assume the throne together. The two brothers reigned for more than a decade, but by 1696, Peter became the sole ruler and created a new law of succession which allowed the Tsar to choose his own successor. Unfortunately for Peter, he was unable to take advantage of this decree, and the throne was left to his wife Catherine I, and later reverted to Peter's grandson, Peter II, after Catherine's death. By 1730, Ivan's second surviving daughter, Anna, would become empress after Peter II's death. As the throne trickled down the family line, it continued bouncing from person to person, seemingly at random, even after an established definite order of succession for members of the Romanov family was put into place by Paul I on April 5, 1797, who'd begun ruling a year earlier. Once again, the succession of the throne was thrown out of order after the death of Paul I, who was murdered by conspirators, supporting his son, Alexander I. And when Alexander I met his demise, his brother Constantine, who was the rightful heir, declined the throne, favoring Nicholas I, who ruled from 1825 to 1855. Both Alexander II and Alexander III ruled thereafter, just before the throne was finally passed down to Alexander III's son, Nicholas II, in 1894. The final ruler of the Romanov dynasty would have his time cut short. Leading up to his abdication, Nicholas II's poor track record as a leader resulted in his unpopularity with the people of Russia. His bad decision-making and poor leadership led to a war fought and lost with Japan in 1904 in an attempt to expand the country. In 1905, after the loss of Japan, the people held a protest in St. Petersburg, demanding reform. More than 100 people died, and hundreds more were wounded when police fired shots into the peaceful protesters. The event became known as Bloody Sunday, and instigated the revolution of 1905, which forced the Tsar to create the Duma, a representative assembly that he had the authority to close when he was unhappy with it, creating greater distrust by the Russian people. Finally, during World War I, as the man in charge of the military, Nicholas led his people into conflict that put an enormous strain on the nation's resources and the loss of millions of lives. Soldiers lacked the necessary munitions to fight and began deserting the military. Those back home faced severe food shortages, and women also took up work outside the home as men were off at war, but their wages were minuscule compared to the men's wages. All of this earned him the nickname Nicholas the Bloody. His position with the people of Russia was displeasing, to say the least. He was also known to be chronically indecisive, with a joke circulating the country that the most powerful people in Russia were the Tsar and whoever had spoken to him last. Despite public opinion, Nicholas was a family man and well loved by his wife and children. By all reports, the Romanovs were happy and devoted to one another. Nicholas II was married to Alexandra, Tsarina of Russia, who had a more powerful and imposing personality than her husband. Being German by birth and the granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria, Alexandra had some struggles of her own when it came to her status with the people of Russia. She was generally viewed as an outsider, causing the Tsarina to become highly sensitive, controlling, and paranoid. She reportedly had a high-strung temperament and needed constant attention and solicitude. The couple had 5 children, 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, who were known as the Grand Duchesses of Russia, and 1 son, Alexei, who was the youngest of the family and also who would have inherited the throne. Alexei was born in 1904 with hemophilia, a bleeding disorder which causes blood to not clot properly. During a time where most upper-class parents were generally not very close to their children, Alexei's condition was the foundation of the Romanovs' close familial bond. His ailment also created a bond between his mother Alexandra and the mystic and self-proclaimed holy man from Serbia whom she was highly influenced by, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin managed to gain the trust and loyalty of the Romanovs through his ability to comfort Alexandra with her anxieties, reassure Nicholas as a leader, and most of all, his healing powers when it came to Alexei's hemophilia. He reportedly significantly lessened Alexei's pain as he underwent a severe bleeding episode in 1908. To the Romanovs, Alexei's delicate condition and Rasputin's ability to aid him made Rasputin company worth keeping. Eventually, Rasputin secured his place of influence in the palace after he allegedly warned Alexandra and Nicholas that Alexei's health would be linked to the strength of the Romanov dynasty. This closeness with Rasputin further isolated Alexandra from the Russian people. March 1917, an announcement made to the people of Russia of an upcoming rationing would stir up the beginning of the end of the Romanovs. On March 8th, International Women's Day, just days after the rationing news, women went on strike, demanding food and the end of the Tsar's rule. By the end of the day, 100,000 protesters who filled the streets of St. Petersburg, which had become Petrograd after the outbreak of World War I, became no match for the Duma, who desperately attempted to regain order. The protest took place while Nicholas was in Mogilev with the military. When Nicholas was away, Alexandra took over in his absence and was often influenced by her confidant Rasputin. A closeness frowned upon by the public as Rasputin's power over the family led to suspicions that he had his own political agenda. The Duma begged Nicholas to choose someone to form a government that the public would trust, but instead, he sent in the troops. His underestimation of the situation resulted in a giant blunder. As the protesters were mainly made up of women and the troops greatly sympathized with their cause, they abandoned their posts and joined in with the protests. Nicholas was forced to return home, and as he began his journey back, Alexandra and their 5 children were advised by the chairman of the Duma to flee Alexandra Palace, just outside of Petrograd, as their safety was threatened by the turmoil within the city. The power and water to the palace were cut off, and more troops continued deserting their posts to join the uprising, leaving Alexandra and her children unprotected from the enraged crowds rioting in the nearby Petrograd. With her husband not yet home, and their children sick with measles, Alexandra refused to go. March 15, 1917, marks the day the Romanov dynasty officially came to an end after over 300 years of ruling. Nicholas II was met in Pskov by 2 representatives of the Duma, who presented him with an announcement that the Duma was assuming power to restore order within the nation, leaving Nicholas no choice but to abdicate. He named his brother Mikhail as his successor, instead of his intended successor, his son Alexei. Mikhail refused the throne the following day after Soviets demanded the end of the Romanov rule. A plan was devised to seek asylum in Britain under King George V, who was Nicholas's first cousin. King George agreed as long as the bill was footed by the Russian government. Despite the provisional government's attempt to get the family to Britain, the Soviets were not for it, demanding that Nicholas be arrested and punished. King George would also rescind the offer after advisors warned of potential disapproval from the British public, which could then impact his own position as monarch. Apart from Britain, there's evidence that there were attempts to use various other connections throughout parts of Europe for asylum, but they did not pan out. On March 21st, the day before her husband would finally return to his family, Alexandra was informed that she and Nicholas were under arrest within the palace. The children and others within the household stayed with them during the arrest. The concern for their safety grew over time, and the head of the provisional government moved the family in August to Tobolsk, Serbia, where they stayed in the former governor's house. They were allowed to bring with them many of their comforts and nearly 40 companions and servants. After another revolution known as the October Revolution, a man named Vladimir Lenin, the newly selected Soviet government's leader, planned to put Nicholas on trial. In April 1918, an official made his way to Tobolsk to bring Nicholas to Moscow for the trial. Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg demanded the Tsar be brought to them after hearing of the plans to take him to Moscow. The official was instructed by the Kremlin to do as the Bolsheviks demanded, and he took the family to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains and handed them over to the Bolsheviks. Upon their arrival, Nicholas, Alexandra, and one of their daughters were placed in the IPATIEV house, which was referred to as the House of Special Purpose. A wooden wall was erected around the outside of the home, preventing anyone from seeing the outside world from within the house. The other children were left back in Tobolsk, unsure of how they would endure the trip. They would follow later in May. On July 17, 1918, after learning that the White Army, a military force loyal to the Tsar, was moving in an attempt to rescue the royal family, the Bolsheviks quickly took action. The recently dethroned Tsar Nicholas II, ex-Tsarina Alexandra, their 5 children, 4 servants, and Eugene Botkin, the family doctor, were awoken from their sleep by their Bolshevik captors. They were told they had to leave in a hurry and were gathered in the cellar of the fortified mansion where they were being imprisoned. While they were waiting, they were provided with 2 chairs, one for Alexandra, who was sick, and one for the dethroned heir, Alexei. Before long, a group of heavily armed men, assembled by Yakov Yurovsky, a commandant of the House of Special Purpose, came into the room along with Yurovsky himself. Yurovsky started by reading out a death sentence announcement to the family before ordering his men to carry out the execution. Each man was intended to fire at a specific family member, but many of them did not actually want to shoot at the girls, so instead they mostly aimed at the ex-Tsar and Tsarina, killing both Nicholas and Alexandra. The firing squad was wild in their aim, as the room filled with smoke and screams. Many of the killers actually ended up wounded by one another in their attempt to hit their targets. The plan was ill-devised, and when implemented, went wrong in just about every way logistically, making the act even more brutal and atrocious. In part, it is said that the team that was assembled were a group of drunken thugs, which could have added to their incompetence. After the first round of fire, most of the family was still alive, but wounded, petrified, and weeping. The Romanovs had unknowingly fashioned what were nearly bulletproof vests for themselves. When they learned their escape from Russia might be inevitable, they hid many of their most valuable jewels by sewing them into their undergarments. The hard stones caused some of the bullets to ricochet off. To finish the job, the men began stabbing the family with bayonets or trying to shoot them in the head. The attack lasted at least 20 minutes. When they were carrying the bodies out to the woods, they realized 2 of the girls were still alive, still coughing and choking. They had to be stabbed again. Yurovsky's intent was to murder the family all at once, burn the bodies, and bury them in the woods nearby without anyone knowing what had transpired. Once the family was finally murdered, the drunken Bolsheviks mocked the royals, stole their treasures, and argued about where they would move the bodies and who would do it. Ultimately, the team failed at this as well. They piled the bodies into a truck that quickly broke down, so they dragged the bodies into the woods, where the Romanovs were stripped naked and all their clothing was burned. The bodies were then thrown down a mine shaft that quickly proved to be too shallow. The bodies were left there, while the men made a run into town for more supplies. Yurovsky was in a panic about how to fix the complete blunder of the assassination, as he was under strict orders to ensure that no one must ever know what had happened. He spent 3 days and nights driving back and forth from the woods, trying to use various elements and methods to destroy the bodies. He beat the bodies with rifles, doused them in sulfuric acid, burned them in gasoline, and then buried whatever was left in 2 separate graves, hoping that separating the graves would be enough to obscure the truth from anyone who might come across them. In an attempt to control public perception of the revolution and keep the public from outrage of the brutal murder of the royal children, the Bolshevik Party announced that they had only killed Nicholas, leaving some to speculate that there could have been royal survivors. As time went on, a number of people would come forward claiming to be Alexei, while some claimed to be Anastasia. Some even claimed that they were the rightful heirs to the Romanov fortune, which was still being held in Swiss banks. The most famous of the Anastasia imposters was a woman who called herself Anna Anderson. However, her critics claimed that she was actually a Polish woman named Franziska Szynkowska. Anderson had spent some time in a mental institution in Berlin and spent years attempting to establish herself as the legal heir to the Romanov fortune. But in 1970, the West German courts rejected her suit and rewarded what remained of the imperial fortune to the Duchess of Mecklenburg. The remains of the royal family were found in 1979, but were kept a secret until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when the bodies were finally exhumed. By the 1990s, genetic tests compared Anderson's DNA with the remains of the royal family and established that there was indeed no connection between her and the Romanovs. Rather, the DNA evidence concluded that Anderson was, in fact, Franziska Szynkowska, and that Anastasia had most certainly been killed with her family in 1918. However, the hopeful story of an Anastasia who survived her family's brutal murder did captivate the imaginations of storytellers, further propelling the mythology and legacy through plays and films. Nicholas II, Alexandra Feodorovna, and 3 of their 5 children, Grand Duchesses Tatiana, Olga, and Anastasia, are buried in the tombs at the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, which is located within the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg, Russia. Prior to their burial, the bodies were all DNA tested to confirm their authenticity. However, they were not laid to rest in the cathedral until July 17, 1998, which was intended to be a symbolic, solemn, and meaningful event in which the state intended to showcase how Russia was reconciling with its past. The Peter and Paul Cathedral at the middle of the fortress is home to the remains of nearly all of the Russian royals since Peter the Great. All of the tombs in Peter and Paul Fortress also serve as exhibits of the Museum of the History of St. Petersburg. Controversy still surrounds the partial remains of the 2 missing Romanov children, Maria and Alexei, which were found in unmarked graves by archaeologists in 2007, because they have not yet been allowed to lay in rest with their family in the cathedral. State authorities kept the remains in a box until 2015, when they turned them over to the church for further investigation. As of 2018, the bodies had been DNA tested with new technology that continued to confirm that they were credibly of the Romanov bloodline. In 2018, Princess Olga, the great-niece of Tsar Nicholas II and president of the Romanov Family Association, implored that Maria and Alexei finally be buried with their parents and siblings, saying that it would finally allow their family to rest in peace together. However, the church has said there needs to be additional testing before they will bury the bodies with the royal family, because royal bones are considered sacred relics, leading some to believe there is more to the delay than what they claim.